Hey everyone, Triceratops Jr. here, back with another speed review, although this isn't much of a speed review as much as it is a game recommendation, because this week this episode, I guess, I'm going to be talking about Vermintide 2, which, if you don't know what that is, I'll explain, but it's a game that I've been playing a lot of, so I kind of just wanted to say, hey, this is a cool game, check this out. Let's get into it. So, Vermintide 2 is the sequel to Warhammer End Times Vermintide, which came out, 5 years ago now, 6 years ago. And pretty much it's a similar kind of game to like your Left 4 Dead kind of game, where it's co-op for up to 4 players and you make your way through a level, completing goals, fighting off hordes of enemies, that sort of vibe. But I think what makes Vermintide so interesting is that it's not necessarily about guns and range as much as it is about the weapons you bring with you, the character you're playing, their abilities, and how you use them to fight off the hordes. And so it is a Warhammer game set in the Warhammer universe, so your main enemies are going to be Ratmen, Chaos Warriors, and a bunch of other stuff depending on like what levels you're playing. But I think what makes the game so cool, especially when compared to something like Left 4 Dead or the upcoming Back 4 Blood, which is another game of the same style, is that Vermintide tends to put a much greater focus on player skill and learning than it does just on like, oh, I picked up this shotgun off the ground and now I'm going to use it, you know? So the whole thing, and I'm specifically talking about Vermintide 2 just because it's the most recent game in the series, there's only 2 of them, but also it has the larger player base right now, so you're more likely to find people to play with online if you play Vermintide 2. Also, it just looks better, but that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. When playing the game, you start by choosing one of up to 5 characters. There's Sienna, who's a mage character. There's Barden, who's a dwarf. There's Victor, who's like a crusader, I guess, or a witch hunter, I think might be his official job. I can't remember. There's Marcus, who is a knight or musketeer almost. And then there's Carillion, who's like an elf huntress. And each of them have different abilities, and some of them have 3 subclasses right now. Some of them have 4, depending on who's had DLC released for them. But with the base game, you get the 5 characters and their 3 classes. And each of those classes have different play styles that you can use, and you can choose which ones you like to use the most. And I think that's really interesting, especially like when you take that into a game that's kind of like Left 4 Dead. And so choosing which class you're playing and which subclass has a huge effect on how the game is going to go, because different characters can do different things. Some characters might have a really big like attack that does a ton of damage to a ton of enemies. Other characters might have some more support-esque abilities where they can make people invisible. They can push enemies back, things like that. And so depending on who's on your team can completely change the course of the combat. And then even further than that, there's the weapons you use. You come in with 2 weapons, depending on which class you're playing, that like decides what weapons you can and can't use. But there are melee weapons and there are ranged weapons. Some classes can only use melee, others can use both. But knowing your weapon and knowing how to use that weapon is really, really important, which is what I was saying about like the skill, I guess, and the thought that goes into playing the game, because you have to learn how to time attacks. You have to learn how to block properly, and you have to learn how to push properly, and all those things can like be essential, especially once you get to like the higher ranks in the game. I usually tend to play around champion level, which I think is like the 3rd highest difficulty. That's like my nice spot for me. I think that's where I have a bit of challenge but also a bit of fun, and it's not too stressful and overbearing. But I think the reason I gravitated to this game so much as opposed to a game like Left 4 Dead, which I played Left 4 Dead first, but the reason I gravitated to this was, one, the fantasy setting. I was never a huge Warhammer person, but I really like fantasy games as opposed to zombie or sci-fi or anything like that. So it kind of just fit for me. But then what stuck me around was, you know how in Left 4 Dead and that kind of game, the characters have relationships with each other. They talk to each other. They say things. They have little quips they'll say to each other. I think no game does that better than Vermintide. All the characters are so sassy and funny with each other. Like it makes running around murdering people an actual joy, you know? It's really, really fun to just like hear the quips while you're slaughtering ratmen with your giant ass greatsword. It just, the vibe is immaculate, as people say. And so I think it kind of drew me in with that. It helped me stick around. And then there's also the fact that the game has like an overarching story, which I'm not saying that Left 4 Dead doesn't, because it does. But I think the way that Vermintide 2 at least builds it in this really great 3-act structure. And then after that, there's also a bunch of free DLC and additions and paid DLC. So there's a lot of freaking content. The game is, I think, way bigger than Left 4 Dead in the grand scheme of things, not including the mod community, because the mods for Left 4 Dead have kind of driven that beyond the point of like being beaten. But I think that for the amount you usually pay for this game, especially when it goes on sale, you get so much content, even without buying any of the DLC. And that's enough to tide you over. But if you really get into it, they've added so much to the game that just like makes it a really great experience. And it's super fun to play levels and replay levels even, because no level will ever go the same as it did the first time. And so and that actually just reminded me, they also just added a roguelike, like similar kind of game mode where you go into this area and you choose the different paths you want to take, and you get boons, which are like your upgrades, and you can upgrade your weapons, and you make your way through the level until you make it to the final boss. And it's super fun. That mode is a little harder to find parties for, I will say. Like, I've had times where I just end up being matched with bots, but it is a really, really fun game mode, and it's definitely a nice change of pace from the main game. Even though it's the same basic content loop, it like is so different enough that it's like super refreshing and fun. But this has been a little bit rambly. I mean, usually these speed review kind of videos are speed recommendations, but I would highly recommend checking out Vermintide 2 or Vermintide if you want to start from the beginning, because you're a real completionist like that. Either way, it doesn't matter. It's just a really fun game that I think people enjoy. I mean, it did really well critically. I know some people don't like the DLC and stuff, but that's whatever. But the base game is done well critically, so it's not like an unknown game or anything, but it's just a super fun game, and I really, really recommend that you check it out. So there you go. If you check it out, let me know what you think in the comments. And if you like this kind of content where I just ramble at you into my microphone and talk about a game I enjoy, subscribe, because I'll do more of it. You don't have to ask me twice. I can talk to my microphone like this all day. I'm really egotistical, and I love the sound of my own voice. So that's the way this goes. Okay, y'all. Peace out. I'll catch you on the flip side, and go play some freaking Vermintide. Or Vermintide 2. Whatever floats your goat.